an innovative toilet along with shelter for privacy. With everything finally settled, he began cultivating the land and spent the rest of the day wondering what vegetables he should plant first. By the time he was finished, it was already late, so he decided to explore for seeds the next day. But in the morning, the land already had plants sprouting. It made no sense how plants could grow from nothing, and Hiraku thought that this was a side effect from his farming tool. Regardless of how they appeared, he began creating a fence to protect them from the zombies at night, and dug out a mound to keep all the creepers out. The process took a few days, but after finally finishing the perimeter, Hiraku noticed the plants have been growing at an incredible speed. With all the spare wood, he decided to create a small log house and used his carpenting skills to create a nice roof, increasing his civilization level. After a few more days of expanding his farm, Hiraku saw a couple of wolves who were very injured, so he tried bringing them inside. With the leftover meat from the giant boar he defeated, Hiraku fed them, but noticed one of them was pregnant. As a child, his sole wish was to have a dog, so he wished for them to keep him company. But the female started going into labor, trying to give them protection. He brought them into the log house and created a fire to keep them warm when the sun set. After a long sleepless night, Hiraku came to see 4 little puppies feeding. To celebrate her healthy birth, he gave them the tastiest meat he'd gathered. A while passed and the dogs stuck around inside his hut, so Hiraku decided to build a new house right next to them. By the time the puppies started running around, his plants were ready for harvest, and he noticed that tomatoes were the first ones to finally produce fruit. He offered some of them to his dogs, and named the male Kuro, and the female Yuki. After a few weeks, Hiraku learned all the secrets behind his almighty farming tool. While thinking about potatoes, the almighty tool planted potato seeds through magic, so he used this trick to create all the foods he's ever wanted. And on top of that, anything he grew with his almighty tool would grow much faster than it normally would. Grateful for the fact that the gods gave him such an overpowered item, Hiraku created 2 statues to commemorate him. That afternoon, he realized that his diet was getting very repetitive, so he decided to begin planting some trees. They may take years to start producing fruit, but the wait will be worth it. As weeks passed, the wolves started growing horns, and they had found a waterfall 30 minutes away. Although creating a canal would make obtaining fresh water much easier, the distance he would have to dig was too long, so he decided to focus on his base for the time being. The farm was growing steadily, and he had begun adding a variety of plants like wheat and sugarcane to sustain him. But while months of progress passed, Hiraku began losing track of days and the winter was fast approaching. There's no chance he could continue farming in this state, and the pelt from the giant rabbits smelled awful as it began rotting. To prepare for the winter, he began gathering food and firewood, but one day, Hiro brought him over to meet a giant spider. With the silk from its tail, it was able to produce a handkerchief with detailed embroidery. It became the new citizen in his small farm, and produced all the textiles in exchange for some potatoes. Whether he needed a coat for the winter, a bed stuffed with leaves, or curtains to block out the cold wind, the spider, Zabuton, produced everything he ever needed. His small hut was slowly starting to become more civilized, and so winter finally arrived. With the fireplace he had built, he was able to survive the harsh cold nights. Still, regardless of whether he was surviving, he was starting to get awfully lonely, worrying that he would forget how to talk to someone. When the long winter passed and spring finally came, the wolf children had grown and decided to leave the nest. But a few days later, they came back with partners. One of them even beat up a lackey wolf and won the girl over like a gigachat. But they weren't the only ones with surprises, because the spider came back with her own children. All of their families were getting bigger, so Hiraku began farming so he can feed them. But as he farmed, the spider began sounding the alarm. Hiro ran towards the source along with Hiraku, and in the middle of the forest, they found a silver-haired girl crying. All of the animals were apprehensive and she tried asking him for help, so Hiraku approached her. But as he tried to cover her, he fell for her trap, and the girl jumped towards him to take a bite of his neck, transforming into a plot-filled vampire. The wolves attacked her right away and began destroying her, causing her to transform back into her little form. He wondered if she was his enemy, but the girl said the reason she had to suck his blood was to recover her energy before withering away. Feeling bad for how hard his dogs had beaten her up, he offered her a bite of his neck, and she began sucking his she began sucking his blood. She transformed back into a bigger version of herself, but Hiraku remembered her being taller and having more plot, so he told her to hurry the up and suck more of his blood so he can see her giant plot again. After sucking all of his bodily fluid, Hiraku showed her around his farm. It was her first time seeing these abnormal fruits, and when she took a bite of them, she thought they were delicious. He was glad someone was enjoying his food, because for the first time, he'd found a person he could enjoy spending time with in this lonely world. Back at his house, he's realized that today has been full of surprises, and wonders if something like this would ever happen again. Her name was Lululasi, and she asked him if she can come to visit him in the future. But he had a different request, and asked her if she would stay with him here forever. He doesn't want it to be just a one-night stand because her pussy hit different, and Lu thinks that he's trying to propose to her. He doesn't want to let this chance go away and doesn't care if she's a vampire. He doesn't know how many more years he can handle being alone. She tells him that it's just so sudden because she wasn't expecting a marriage proposal, but Hiraku realizes that she misunderstood what he actually meant. After understanding that he was actually proposing, he decided to double down, begging her to marry him. Lu smiles at him, saying that she wants to stay with him forever. He drags her to bed for another one-night stand. The next day, he used the long stick on his hoe to cultivate babies with his new hoe. They sit next to each other and stare at the trees growing, but the spider begins ringing the alarm again. Hiraku runs over and wonders why he's feeling deja vu. He frees the angel girl and thinks that this story is about to get real interesting with all the plot development. Lu tries sneaking away, but the angel girl has finally found her and is ready to come drag her away, so the dogs eat her out.
What do you mean by that?
She's surprised Lu has been hiding inside the forest and is angry that she climaxed after the dogs ate her out. Lu is also angry that she climaxed when the dogs ate her out, and Hiraku wonders why getting injured would lead to them climaxing. The angel girl wonders who this man is, and Lu blushingly introduces him as her husband. While her face burns redder than a tomato, Giant Plot Cannons introduces herself as Tia. And she's come to find Lu because there's a bounty on her head. She was constantly researching different concoctions and kept blowing up the kingdom whenever something didn't go her way. Who reveals this was the reason she was in the middle of the forest on that day, so she bent over the table and asked Tia if she would like to start living here. She promises to show her all of the crops, like Hiraku's eggplant next to their round peaches.
Out of pocket for that shit. Way out of pocket.
Lu goes on to show her around the farm, and Hiraku tries to teach her how to cut cabbage out. After cutting it, he prepared it as a meal and sprinkled some salt on it before handing it to her. She thought it was delicious, and after a long day of farming, they cleaned themselves up using their magical abilities. Inside his house, she tried strawberries for the first time, and Lu told her that they'll be showing her how to make a strawberry cream pie next. She grabbed onto her arms, begging her to live here with them because her body can't handle everything if she's alone. This was the beginning of their life together. Tia thinks she's enjoyed the strawberry cream pie, so she asks him for more strawberries. But Hiraku thinks expanding even more right now would result in spoiled food. While they continued walking, Hiraku noticed Kuro's new puppies and decided to build a stable for them in the open field next to their farm. After he was done, he noticed all of Zabuton's children casting their silk to fly away. At the same time, Tia told him that she's also going to be leaving for a while, and started flying away on her wings. A few days later, Tia came back and brought even more girls to add to the harem. They're high elves, because they have giant plots, and all of them introduce themselves. They're also all related, so incest is going to prevail in this plot. Hiraku wonders why there aren't any guy elves, but Tia reveals the sad reality they've had to endure. During the last Great War, their entire male population was destroyed, and they've been roaming the woods until now. Their only wish is to repopulate now, and beg Hiraku to help them out. With the village's population increasing, Hiraku began building them a house for all of them to live together. Their skills in construction and woodworking allowed them to build the house within just 10 days, and they thought it's much nicer than Hiraku's dirt shack. However, at the very least, he wishes that in this spacious house, they can feel safe and at peace. As the days pass, the elf leader wants to thank him for letting them stay here by mining and blacksmithing for him, so they begin building a furnace in the earth. After processing the iron, Hiraku sees the metal pots they've created, and they tell him that they can do all kinds of things after living in the wild for 200 years. Still, the only thing they've wished to be able to do was to settle down and reproduce.
じゃあ一つはクリアだな。
Hiraku thought it would be for the best to avoid having plot development with all the elves, and stayed a typical anime protagonist. While farming one day, the elf girls noticed that he has a giant wheat field, and one of them asked him if she could make some bread, telling him she has the rarest yeast in the lands. Hiraku was excited, so the girls began baking bread and turned it into bread sticks for Hiraku to try out. At the same time, they all wonder if Hiraku's plot is this long and tasty. Now that he's finally able to make some bread, he would like to expand the wheat fields, but he realizes that their expansion is starting to get out of control. He asks Lu who owns this land, and she tells him that while nobody owns it, it's probably under the Demon Lord's control. However, since he created all of this land without support, this land belongs to Hiraku. At night, the girls gather and wonder how Hiraku's been able to tame the Inferno Wolves and the Demon Spider. Even these crops shouldn't be able to grow in this soil, and they begin wondering why he has no knowledge about their world. At the same time, Hiraku's realized that he hasn't been building the waterway in a long time, so he decides to make it tomorrow's mission. In the morning, Hiraku sees Zabuton pointing towards a queen bee, and Hiraku decides to build a bee house for them to create honey for him. He spends the entire afternoon preparing a reservoir. They began mass-producing the concrete waterway. The elf girls bent over to make sure that all of them were placed in the correct spot. While they focused on doing the hard things, Hiraku filled all of their holes with his hard hammer. Because of their efficiency, the waterway was finished within a single day, and the reservoir was already filled. This should allow them to water the crops a lot easier, but Hiraku noticed that the reservoir was also getting him fish without doing any work. He thought that even though the rabbits were dangerous in this forest, at least the fish were peaceful. But a giant fish nearly devoured him right then. The girls saw him cooking the fish, and knowing that it was from the Forest of Death, they wondered if it was truly safe to eat. Hiraku finished preparing it and tried giving them some, but they told him that they wanted a different kind of meaty dinner. Hiraku had no idea what type of meat they were talking about, so he began eating it and thought it was delicious. Both of the girls tried it and thought it was delicious, and the rest of the elves wanted some of his meat. Diggity. To satisfy all of them, Hiraku began capturing more fish and preserving them with salt. Wishing to expand their diet, Hiraku tried tilling the ground while thinking about rice, and while it managed to grow, the texture of the rice was off. Since they have an entire waterway built, he decided to begin building a rice paddy with the elves. After mending the ground for hours, Hiraku released all of the girls' floodgates. Sorry, I meant he released the floodgate and asked the elf girls for their help. All of the elf girls started getting wet and Leah didn't like the slimy liquid. Together, they all bent over and planted all of the rice plants. A few days later, all of the plants were ready for harvest, and Hiraku put them up for drying. Leah was impressed that he knew all of this, but Hiraku's grateful that he always watched a farming idol before he died with cancer. Once all the plants were dried up, Hiraku used his farming tool to create a thresher and showed them how to harvest the rice. The girls saw all the work it took to prepare the rice and wondered if he was finally done. But Hiraku revealed that there's one more step. He prepared to cook the rice and asked Lu to use her magic to light up the fire, so she prepared to release her ultimate blast to burn everything to smithereens. But he told her to calm down, disappointing her. With a small flame, Hiraku cooked the rice until it was finally ready and created it into rice balls for the girls to taste. Lu decided to take a bite. The girls thought it was disgusting and regretted doing all that work this whole time. But Hiraku knew they were lying when all of the rice was gone. He decided to expand the rice farm, and all the girls began cleaning up after they were done. How the f*** does that even happen? Hiraku sees how they can all clean themselves with magic, and wishes he had a bath to clean up. Since he's finally built a waterway, he decided to build a bath, and showed the girls his blueprints for how he was going to design the plumbing. The girls wondered why they would do all this if they could just swim in the river, but Hiraku reminded them that they would freeze in the winter. Plus, he really wanted a bath for health and totally not to stare at them without any plot armor. The girls began building a furnace to warm the water and created the biggest possible bathtub. Everything was going great, but Hiraku wondered what they would do with all the dirty water. Tia thinks that slimes could take care of purifying the water, but Hiraku wondered if they were the dangerous monsters that destroyed adventurers. Tia has no idea what he's talking about, so she flew away and brought some slime for him. He placed a few of them in the water purification area and inside the bathroom. Just like that, their wastewater problem was solved, so he began grabbing firewood to burn. But one of them had mushrooms growing on it. He'd been weary of mushrooms this entire time since they might be poisonous, but all of the girls thought it was safe and wanted to eat all of them, so Hiraku began preparing some logs for mushroom growth. By sunset, Hiraku had finally completed the bath and tried explaining it to the girls, but they wanted to see a hands-on experience. He removed his plot protection and began showing them how it's done. But the girls started to feel a different kind of liquid dripping, so they all removed their plot armor and decided to join him. Lu told him it's perfectly fine for all of them to do it together, and Hiraku felt the bone of his sword growing sharp and hard. In the following morning, Hiraku saw all of the edible mushrooms that were grown. But the dogs had brought over more elves. Of course they were females, but who's complaining? Leah reveals that they used to live together, and he's glad to have them all join him. Leah suggests they work on expanding his home so they can all have more space, and cheers them on to begin children making. Hiraku didn't know why they were so optimistic. What a fucking waste. Kuro's noticed that his master's harem has been expanding, and tells us about his story. Before he had a master, he never had a name to go by. Ever since he was born, he'd been roaming alone, and never lost a fight against any other male. His only wish was to continue living freely, but when he met that one female, she destroyed him. After his complete defeat, they began traveling together, but her belly started to grow one day. He wanted to do everything to continue protecting her, but peace wouldn't last, and a giant bear was about to annihilate them. However, after they were gravely injured, the bear walked away. Still, they could no longer hunt for food and accidentally reached the most dangerous place of the forest, the center of it. They saw a human walking around without a care in the world, but Kuro noticed the tool in his hand and felt the limitless power coming from it. They had already made peace with their lives being over, but he began taking care of them. And Kuro noticed the food was made of a gate boar, impressing him that he was able to defeat such a strong monster. After their children were born, they decided that Hiraku would become their master, and enjoyed all of the food he prepared for them. Before long, their children grew up into a big family, and they noticed how Hiraku's harem was also growing. But he still had a single concern. Their master hasn't discovered that they are the legendary infernal wolves, but Kuro thinks that it's fine anyway. He's grateful that his life has led him to such a great life with him. After a few weeks, the new large house was completed, and Hiraku remembered all the digging and wood cutting it took to prepare this house. Even though he knew it would be this big, he never imagined how nice it would look on the inside. They showed him the nice room they've created for him, and opposite his main room was the large dining room. In the back was the kitchen, and on the sides were even more stoves for big meals. Finally, the cellar was big enough to store a lot of food and firewood for the winter. On the second floor, the girls saw their rooms and were glad they each had individual space for themselves. But Hiraku noticed one of the rooms had a giant bolt locking it.
Yes! 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 Yes!
見なかったことにした。
No! No! No!
In addition to his god statues, Hiraku created some dog statues to decorate the entrance of his house, and thought it was shaping really nicely. Inside his new house, Hiraku's gathered all the ingredients for a new recipe. The girls wonder what he's going to be cooking, and he reveals that it's a food called curry. The girls wish they didn't have to taste another one of his shitty meals and would rather be cooked in the pot instead. He went out to harvest some spice for his curry, and the girls realized they've never seen these plants before. This was another power of Hiraku's almighty farming tool. With it, he can grow plants that are really sensitive in any climate. For the spices, he's going to need to come in tia. Sorry, I meant he needed cumin, and he sees that the flower has already bloomed. As for the next plant, he needed turmeric, and with the girls' magic, they dried out all of the spices. Finally, he needed coriander and cilantro. The dogs wanted a taste too, but when they smelt the cilantro, they ran away in fear. After gathering a little more black pepper and cayenne, Hiraku was finally ready to start cooking, but noticed that the girls had gotten bored with his ugly ass and left. At the kitchen, he wondered if Leah was going to be the only one helping him, and Leah told him that her plot's better than the other girls anyway. He ignored her attempts and started preparing the meal. They cooked the meat and tried seasoning, but Hiraku realized he's been missing something this entire time. It's naan, and he's angry that he managed to forget all about it. They began rolling out the bread together, and after they cooked a mountain of it, his meal was finally finished cooking. All of the girls gathered to try out his curry and thought it looked like shit, but he encouraged them to try it out. Lu and Tia took a bite.